Well, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I hope you enjoyed the pizza and everything. We're going to be talking about RxJS. Who's using RxJS? Hands in the air. Oh, this is an introduction. What are you guys doing here? All right. Well, hopefully you're going to get something out of this topic. Angular developers, raise your hands. Okay, so basically everybody that's using Angular is using RxJS, right? Because we have observables. Yeah. Cool. That makes a lot of sense. Jesse gave me a brief introduction. You can check out my blog, brianflove.com. I tweet occasionally, mostly Angular and JavaScript stuff. If you want, I know nobody has laptops, so a couple of you do. If you want to follow along, you can grab my demo files. If you just go to github.com/belove, I pinned it. So you're welcome to clone that out and check it out. But we're going to actually be going through all the code here tonight. So what is RxJS? RxJS is the JavaScript implementation of the ReactiveX library, right? So if you do a Google search for RxJS, you're going to notice like the first result is going to take you to reactivex.io/RxJS, right? And so RxJS is an implementation of the ReactiveX library. There's other implementations, .NET, Java, PHP. So other languages are also using ReactiveX as a library. And RxJS allows us to build asynchronous modular event-based apps. Let me just quickly break that down. I think we all know what that basically means. But asynchronous, we're all doing it, right? Whether it's HTTP client or whatever thing is going on behind the scenes, whether it's a socket, you're dealing with asynchronous activity constantly in your app. It's modular. All of the code in RxJS is broken up into modules that you can import using ES6 style imports. And it's event-based, right? So we can deal with events in our application, whether that's a form that's changing values, or maybe a user clicking on a button or whatever it is. And so RxJS allows us to build these apps and allows us to do it in a very easy manner. RxJS deals with streams of subject matter through the application. And we're going to take a look here in a second, kind of, where we came from, circa 2013, 2014, we had promises. Everybody was like, that's awesome. No more callback hell, thank God, right? And then now we get into RxJS where we're talking about streams of data, right? So it's not a single emission of values, but values that are emitted anytime those kind of come through. Yeah, and it allows us to observe those streams of data. So the RxJS actually isn't really new. I mean, I hate to break our bubbles. We all think it's fantastic, myself included. And I know that's probably pretty blurry for you guys to read. But RxJS actually implements what's called the observer design pattern. How many of you heard of like the Gang of Four design patterns book, like Bible, right? Okay, yeah, so it's in there. It was written in 1994, right? So RxJS, 2018, 2016, whatever, came out. Not really a brand new concept, but certainly brand new to a lot of us on the front end world. But the observer design pattern is pretty basic, as you can see. We basically have a subject that has a collection of observers, and then those observers have concrete observers. In this instance, they've got an abstract method called update that needs to be implemented in each of the concrete observers. And then whenever a value is emitted, the subject basically just loops over all of those observers and sends the value, right? So very simple pattern. This is kind of what's going on behind the scenes in RxJS. But obviously, we have a lot more functionality and capability than just this simple pattern. So you might be asking yourself, what are observables, right? So observables implement the observer design pattern, like I said. And they basically watch a subject for this thing called a notification, right? Which is kind of like an object that's, we'll talk a little bit more about here in a second. And this notification is going to be emitted, right? And we're going to push those notifications to our observer instances. And we can have 0, 1, or many observers, right? The other thing that's really cool about observables is that we get this functional array style operators, right? And we're not going to dive into all the operators tonight. Hopefully we're going to do the kind of a series on RxJS. So if you can come back next month, I think it's the first Wednesday if you want to put it on your calendar, I'm going to dive into about 15 to 20 different operators that are available in RxJS. And I know that probably sounds like a lot, but that's not even like half of them, right? Ben Lesh, who is the core developer for RxJS, is incredibly productive, and to say the least. And so there are a lot of operators. But we'll take a look at what I've found, at least in my development experience here in Breebug and over the last 2 years or so using RxJS as kind of like the core set, right, that I tend to use over and over and over again. And so we'll dive into those. You can see I've got a couple examples here. These should sound very similar to what you see on array.prototype, right? We've got our map, our filter, reduce, find, all other kinds of operators that are going to be there. And so let's talk a little bit about like where we've come from, right? So if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of sit as I do some of my code examples. So how many have used promises? Yeah, everybody. What's that?
Defer.
So let me, real quick, just to show you kind of, I'm going to be switching back and forth through some of my demos. Just to give you kind of an overview, this is a simple project that I created. I'm using Webpack with Webpack Dev Server, and I've got that running locally on localhost 8080. And then I've just got an index file, and I'm just going to kind of be commenting these import statements out as we kind of go through each demo, right? And so my first one here is going to be a promise. And this should look super familiar, right? So we create a new promise. We give it our resolve function. We're going to set a timeout. After a second, we're going to send that value off, but that'll be fulfilled. And then we use then, because promises are thenable. And then we're just going to log out that value. And I already did it here, but I mean, I can prove it to you in 1 second. Boom, hello from Promised Land, right? Let's go ahead and let's move away from Promised Land, because that's what we all did for years, and that was awesome. But now let's go to Observable Land. So let me go to my index file. I'm just going to comment this out. Comment that. All right. So we've got a little bit more going on here, right? First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new observable, and I'm going to give it a function that accepts an observer, right? And that's this right here. And then inside my function, I'm going to set an interval, and every 2 seconds, I'm going to emit that value. And right now, I'm just emitting a simple string value, right? Pretty kind of simple and contrived example. And then I also return out of that function a teardown function, right? So this is going to be invoked when the observer completes, right? And we'll look at, I got a slide here in a second or two where we'll talk about some of the different things in the observable pattern. But we're just going to emit that next value, and then you can see this should look all very familiar to us if we're using Angular and observables. We're going to subscribe to that value, and we're going to receive that value, and we're just going to log it out. And it's already running. You can see here that if I reload, every 2 seconds, we're going to get this new value, right? And so this is it's a very simple kind of way to show, but the difference is different. One of the primary differences between a promise and observable is we go from a single value being fulfilled or rejected, I suppose, to a stream of values, right? And so every 2 seconds, I'm getting a new value. Now, obviously, again, this is a very simple example. This could be a socket that's emitting new values, or whatever it is. This could be an event in your application, or whatever you're kind of subscribing to, right? Cool. So, so I mentioned like notifications. So what are notifications? A notification is it's a class, right? If you look at the documentation, and it's basically a container that's going to wrap, and it's going to represent that event or value that's going to be emitted. It's going to be pushed through the observable to all of its observers, right? It also includes some metadata about the event or value. It basically includes the type of message, whether it's a fulfilled message, which would be a next, whether it's an error that occurred, or whether it's a completion notification. So there's 3 different types of notifications that are going to come through. So what are observers? we're talking again, this whole observer design pattern. So observers are going to receive the notification from an observable, and it's managed by another class called a subscription. And observers are going to react to that next error and completion notification from the observable. And we're just kind of going down the pipe here, right? So then next, what are subscriptions? Subscriptions are basically the link between an observable and an observer, right? And we can invoke a method on the subscription class called unsubscribe that will stop listening to any further notifications that might be emitted by that observable. We can also invoke another method that you might have used called add, right? So if I've got a subscription, an instance of that subscription class, I can then add child subscriptions to that parent, right? And that's kind of handy because if I have child subscriptions that are all subscribed, I can call unsubscribe on the parent subscription object, and it'll unsubscribe from all the children. And we'll take a little bit, you'll see that in some of the code demos if that doesn't make sense. And we'll also talk a little bit about dealing with subscription management at the end of this talk. So you might be asking yourself at this point, all right, I get it. This is great, awesome, thanks Brian, appreciate it, man. But like, what's the deal? Is this like gonna be official? Ian, I forget your name, man. Evan talked about TC39, right? So TC39 is basically this working group within the ECMA group. So we all know like ECMAScript, right? So this TC39 is this group that basically deals with proposals. They go from stage 1 to stage 3, and then they eventually make it into the language, right? And so basically the answer to this question is, well, not yet. So that's why we have RxJS, which is a library that we're going to include until this becomes native in browsers. I have no idea when that's going to happen. You could probably tweet at the Chrome team and maybe they would tell you, maybe not. But basically, RxJS provides us ECMAScript observables today. And you can go actually, he was mentioning he follows them. You can go, if you just like Google search TC39, they've got like a github.com, they've got like a proposals page. And you can see that Observable is listed on that page as a proposal, and it's currently stage 1. So it's got a little bit of refining and some things that's going to have to happen before it actually makes it into the language. But eventually, like promises, this will become native. We won't have to use RxJS. Ben Lesh will lose his job at Google or wherever he was at Netflix. That's okay. I'm sure he'll go on and do amazing things. I'm sorry, Ben, if you're watching this. And so eventually, observables will become just this thing that we just use every day. And in general, this is totally off topic. In my opinion, I think you kind of see observables being heavily used in the Angular community today, and it hasn't quite made it into like React and some of the other communities, right? They're still doing a lot with promises and stuff. They'll catch up with Angular one day. Don't worry. But yeah, so it's certainly because of Angular, observables are becoming more mainstream, and we'll start to see a lot more of it. So cool. Any questions? I'm flying through some of this stuff. Anybody like, I'm lost? Good? You guys are all smart people. Awesome. Sweet. So what are subjects? Subjects are a source of a notification. So if you go and you look at the documentation, a subject simply extends an observable. It's just a subclass of observable, right? And subjects allow us to have a couple of different behaviors on observables. One of the main things you might have noticed, at least I did, I'm working with an observable and everything's great, and I'm like, well, what if I want so my HTTP client emits a value. What if I want to manually emit another value into that observable stream? Observable doesn't really have a method for that, right? It's got subscribe, now it's got pipe, it's got a couple other methods in there, but there's no way to say, hey, observable, here's another value, right? And so that's where subjects come into play. And we'll look at a bunch of the different subjects that RxJS provides. But basically, a subject is an observable that has a couple more methods like next, right? So I can have an observable, and I can just next methods into that observable stream. Cool. So let me get back down here. So let's take a look at some code for subjects. Close this. Comment this out. All right. So the first thing you're going to notice is, we're going to import subject from the subject module. Make it bigger. Is that better? Okay. Cool. So the first thing you're going to notice, like I said, is we're going to go ahead and import that class subject from the RxJS /subject module. And then we're going to create a new instance of a subject. I'm using TypeScript here. I hope you're not offended if you're like pure JS guy and you're like, what is this type garbage? Please don't be mad at me. But most of you guys are Angular developers, so you're either been forced to use TypeScript or you absolutely love it. And I'll let you decide where you sit on that. So I'm giving this a generic type. I wouldn't have to, right? I could just say, give me a new subject of an instance. But I'm going to specify the generic type in this instance, say, give me a new subject, and that subject is going to emit values that are of type number, right? I'm going to go ahead and subscribe to that subject. And here you can see that I'm subscribing to all 3 notifications, right? I don't know about you, but most of the time when I was developing Angular apps like a year and a half ago, I'm just doing like .subscribe and like giving it like a fat arrow function. And I don't really care sometimes about like error or completion, right? Maybe I was being lazy. I'm sorry if that was the case. But you can see here that I'm going to have, these are ES6 fat arrow functions if you're not familiar with them. But basically this is a function that's going to receive that value, that next value. And then I'm just going to log out that next value. And then I'm going to do a warn if I get an error, which isn't going to happen because demos always go successful. And then I also have a completion, right? And so this is going to be executed when that observable stream is completed, right? So when I say, hey, I'm all done, I unsubscribe, and I say, hey, I'm good to go, that completion notification is going to get fired off as well. And we should see that work. I'm going to go ahead and subscribe again, just to kind of show you this in the console. And you'll see that I've got like before 1 versus before 2. Just so we can kind of see both of those subscriptions come into the console. And then you can see, unlike an observable, I have this next method, right? And so this subject extends observable. And so now on that subject, I can invoke next. And I'm just going to emit some values, so 1, 2, and 3, simple number, integer values. And then I'm actually going to late subscribe. And what I mean by late subscribe is like I've already emitted 1, 2, and 3. And then I'm going to subscribe after those values. And then you're going to see I'm going to emit another value 4, and then I'm going to complete, right? So just to kind of mess with it a little bit and say, okay, what's going to happen here? Just kind of playing around a little. So let's go ahead and I'm going to reload. Oh, yeah, right. I'm thinking there's a timer. Sorry. Yeah, I was like, that's too fast. So you can see here we get before 1, before 2, and they all come in. I'm incrementing that value on each subscription. Oh, no, yeah, that's right. I'm nexting each of those values. So before gets all of those values. You also know that before 1 and 2 also get the integer value 4, which was like kind of after the fact, which totally makes sense. And then finally, you'll see that after, it only gets the integer 4. It doesn't get 1, 2, or 3, right? Because I late subscribed, right? And then you'll see that then my completions are going to fire for both the before 1, the before 2, and the after. And that is because I complete the stream. Any questions there before I keep moving on?
Can you scroll up to the code?
Yeah, sure. That kind of makes sense here, how I'm subscribing and then emitting some values into the stream. Yep, using next. And then I simply just kind of, I subscribe again, but kind of after those values have been emitted, 1, 2, and 3. So then this subscription here is only going to get what comes in the future, which is 4. Right? And then I'm going to go ahead and say I'm complete, and then all those completion functions are going to fire. Cool? Awesome. Next, I want to show you, I talked a little bit about how subjects have different behaviors, right? And so we're going to dive into 3 of those. And John, there's only 3, right? It's the only ones I know about.
As far as I know.
That's right. Yeah. You can check these out on the documentation.
You can also create your own.
Oh, that's true.
It's possible to write your own
Yeah.
subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah. And so RxJS ships with 3 different. I guess you've got your observable, which you've got observable and subject extends observable, right? And then these next 3 classes all extend subject, right? So async subject extends subject, subject extends observable, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at an async subject. And this code should be very familiar to what we just saw. Basically, we're instead of importing subject, we're going to import async subject. We're going to create a new instance of our async subject class. We're going to store that in a constant called s. And then we're going to subscribe to that. We're going to emit some values, 1, 2, and 3. We're going to do a late subscription to that subject. And then we're going to go ahead and complete. Oh, hold on. I have to update my index file. So what you're going to notice here is you're like, well, wait, what happened to 1 and 2, right? So an async subject will only receive the last value that's emitted, and only the last value, right? So whether I subscribe before or whether I subscribe late or afterwards, you're going to see that both of these subscriptions are only going to get the last value that's emitted from your
Last before completion? Or?
the last before, actually the last with completion.
Okay.
So let me show you that. That's actually really important. So if I don't complete it,
Nothing.
we get nothing, right? So it's only when that stream is completed that an async subject is going to say, all right, now that we're complete, let's go grab those last 2 values, and here they are, right? So there may be a use case for this in your application where you're like, I really only care the last of...
Last 2 because there are 2 subscribers.
That was because there was 2 subscribers, but they each only received the last value, right? And catch me if I mess anything up here. Absolutely, just call me out here. So when I do that complete, you can see they're both going to get just that value 3, right? And then we're going to get both of those completions are going to fire. All right, now let's take a look at behavior subject. This should, again, should be looking pretty familiar here. We're going to import behavior subject from RxJS behavior subject module. We're going to create a new behavior subject. And one thing to note here is look at the constructor for our behavior subject class, right? It requires what they call, it's either like you call it a default value. I think the docs refer to it as like a seed value, basically. So you have to provide it that value. I'm in TypeScript, so if I go ahead and hit that, VS Code says, sorry, you're not meeting that. So I have to provide it with some sort of initial value or seed value. I'm going to go ahead and subscribe to that subject. We're going to emit a couple of values, 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to do a late subscribe. Oh, did I save that? Yeah, I got behavior subject. Cool. Awesome. So, unlike async, my early subscription, before whatever you want to call it, it's going to get all those values. So it gets the initial seed value 0, and then it gets 1, 2, and 3 that's emitted in the stream. And then you'll notice that my after value also gets 3. But the important part to note is this is happening, I'm subscribing after that value was emitted. So it'll still always grab the last value, whether that's the seed value, because you always have to give it a seed value, or it's the last value that was emitted into the stream. So this is behavior.
What's different from just the subject? That's kind of the main difference between it and subject.
It'll grab the last value.
It'll always grab no matter when you subscribe, you'll
Always get the last value in a behavior subject. And it always gets a value because you have to give it a seed value. So it'll never get like undefined or null or whatever, right?
Even if there is no like next 1, 2, and 3, and you subscribe, you'll get another 0.
I should get 0. So if I comment those out, before gets 0, my late subscription, both of those really doesn't matter at this point because now I'm just doing initial value, subscribe, and they're both going to get that seed value. So then, if we go ahead and complete it, you're going to see that after never gets the value because we completed the stream before I subscribe to it, right? Unlike the async behavior, which will still get that. Cool. Any other questions on behavior subject? I've personally just, kind of as an anecdote, behavior subject was kind of a breakthrough for me in some of the stuff I was working with, where you want to get that last value. It's really helpful. Yeah.
So how does it get the name? What is the behavior subject? What does that mean, behavior versus?
Anybody? Hold on, let me tweet it, Ben. Hey, Ben. I don't know, man. I couldn't.
Special behavior.
It's a special behavior. Let's see, RxJS.
Although that's good.
You
You don't have to look it up now, Mom.
Yeah. This is actually a good page. This is not specific to RxJS. This is like a reactive in general. When an observer subscribes to a behavior subject, it begins by omitting the most recent, and then continues to omit any other. Yeah, there's no
explanation.
There is no explanation for the madness. I'm sorry, man. That's what they decided to call it because it behaves really great.
There is actually.
Oh, you got something?
There's an important note right down. Scroll down just a little more. However,
if the source observable terminates with an error, the behavior subject will not emit any items to subsequent observers. We'll simply pass along the error notification to the source observable.
It's the same as completion.
So, I just
it
looked
has
it
to
up.
have good behavior to complete.
So apparently the term behavior is a functional reactive programming term that already exists. And that does mean it's like a value that changes over time. That's what I'm reading on this Stack Overflow answer anyways. Cool.
Thank you, Reed. Yeah! All right, cool. Let's keep moving along. No more hard questions. I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. So let's look at a replay subject. And then this will be the last of the 4 subjects that we've talked about. Let me go ahead and get that. Let's go here. All right. I tried to make these, very much the same. So that way there's not a lot of complexity to the code. I'm going to go ahead and create a new instance of a replay subject. Note there's no seed value, right? So I don't have to, it's just like our async subject and our regular subject. So no seed value required for a replay subject. I'm going to go ahead and subscribe to that subject just like we were before. I'm going to omit some values, 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to do a late subscribe, and I'm going to complete. Let me save that. And, oops, sorry about that. Great. So very similar to kind of our behavior subject, a replay subject, you'll notice our before, we totally expect that, right? It gets 1, 2, 3. No surprise there. But what's interesting is our late subscription is actually going to get all of the values that have been emitted to that subject, that observable stream. So it literally replays the stream into that subject, right? And then we go ahead and we call complete.
But streams are potentially endless.
But streams are potentially endless. But at this point, those are all the values. It basically goes back in history, and then it continues to, I can continue to listen or observe, right, until I get that completion notification. Yeah.
but I think your point is there's a memory concern there. Is that what you're talking about?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I mean, if you have an endless observable and you're replaying it, there could be a massive amount of data.
There could be a massive lot of data that gets emitted into that. Yeah, and your user might not be so happy.
Yeah. The quick test for that is to accidentally use a replay subject when you're watching mouse and keyboard events in the browser.
Ooh. And just kind of scroll around for about 5 minutes and then subscribe after like a timeout. And
I mean,
just,
for subscription, I don't even think you have to have a subscription at all. It's going to accumulate them no matter
oh,
what.
it's just going to accumulate them in
It just
memory.
accumulates
Yeah,
them.
absolutely.
Yeah, so eventually your browser just kind of
Yeah, because garbage collection is not going to wipe them out because
Yep.
it's pointing to it. There's references to it. So it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to hold on to all this data.
Right.
So probably there should be a constructor parameter that will tell you at what depth you're looking.
At what depth?
Yeah. That'd be,
I think, isn't there?
well, you might be able to extend replay subject with your own to give it a limit.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, you could use an operator basically at that point, right?
I don't think that'll stop the thing
No,
from
I
accumulating.
believe-
No, well, it'll still just keep them all. Yeah. All right. With great power comes great responsibility with the replay subjects. So now you know. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. That's awesome. Cool. I want to, any questions? Just give an opportunity to pause. Everything is good, as the Germans would say. All is klar. Cool. How are we doing on time? Awesome. So now I want to talk a little bit about unicast and multicast. So each subscriber or each subscribed observer owns an independent execution of the observable. And that might make, it's a tough sentence to digest, and we'll get into this and I'll give you some examples so hopefully it's clearer. And a subject can multicast to multiple subscribed observers. And we'll see where this comes into play. Actually, just in my own experience, I was, I don't know what project this was. It was like maybe a year ago. I'm just banging out Angular. I'm loving it. You know what I mean? The async pipe is like, this is so cool, right? So I got my HTTP client. Well, I guess back then it was just the HTTP service, right? And, I've got this wired up. Everything's great. And I got this component. And I've got like 3 dumb components or stateless, whatever you want to call them, inside, right? And each one of those, I'm like binding in some values with an async pipe. And I'm like, this is fantastic. I don't have to like subscribe. I don't have to do anything. The async pipe is so awesome, right? And I'm just cruising along. And then like 2 days into the project or whatever, I look over, 2 days later, I look over my network tab. I'm like, that's really funny. There's like 3 requests for the same thing. That's really strange. Why is that going on? I don't need to do 3 requests here. And then I go, well, that's interesting because I have 3 async pipes. Oh, okay, well, let's get rid of one. Now there's only 2 requests. All right, something's going on here, right? And so my little story is to hopefully translate what we're talking about in terms of unicast versus multicast. And what you'll know, what we'll see anyways, is observables do what's called unicast by default. So every subscriber is going to go ahead and the producer inside of your subscriber, because HTTP is cold observables, is going to fire off a network request for every time I subscribe. And so now all of a sudden I'm doing all this network traffic. Now thankfully, those were really fast requests. I was actually doing it locally, so I didn't even notice. I was like, oh, okay, whatever. But that could be a problem, right? If we've got a really heavy payload or whatever it is, maybe our dev, our ops guy comes down to us like, hey, dude, why are you like hitting the server 25 times for the single request, right? And so that's where unicast and multicast comes into play. And I've got a couple of demos here. Let me switch back over. We're going to do unicast first. Oh, wrong one. Save that. Okay. I don't have a lot of screen real estate here, but let's try to dive through this real quick. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new observable, right? So we saw in the very beginning of the demos, where we just created a simple observable, and that's basically what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go ahead and create a variable I on the outside of my observable. Going to set it to 0. And then here's my new observable, and I'm going to give it a function that receives the observer. And I'm going to go ahead and log out every time a new subscription is created to this observable, right? And then I'm going to increment I. And then I'm going to set an interval. And every 2 seconds, I'm going to emit that value I. Okay? I've got a simple teardown function that's just going to clear that interval. And then down below, I'm going to create 2 subscriptions. Let me kind of scroll over for you. Basically, I'm going to subscribe, and we're going to log it out, and we're going to say first subscription and the value. And then I'm going to subscribe again, and I'm going to log out second subscription and the value, right? And I'm actually going to, this is an example of doing some very simple subscription management. You can see my observable, the subscribe method, returns an instance of a subscription. And then I'm going to use that add method to add a child subscription to this parent subscription. And then after 5 seconds, I'm going to go ahead and on that parent subscription, I'm going to call unsubscribe. Let's see what this does. Oh, perfect. So you can see that I get 2 subscriptions that were created, right? Inside of that observer function. And you can see that first subscription, they both are going to get the value 2 because that's going to get hit twice, really, right? Line after line. First, I'm going to subscribe. First it's 0. I is 0. I'm going to subscribe. It's going to go to 1. I'm going to subscribe again. It's going to go to 2. I create both of those subscriptions, and then they're both going to get those value, that same integer value 2 both times, right? And then after the 5 seconds has lapsed, I go ahead and run my teardown function by unsubscribing, right? And this is fine, but this is a good example of, unicasting, right? So we get 2 subscriptions that are being created. Not a problem here, but what in my example, when we start talking to like an HTTP client, or maybe we're consuming some sort of really heavy service or whatever it is, this could be a problem, right? If my instance, I was doing 3, but you may have more or less. And so this kind of shows us that observables are unicast by default. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can multicast. Uncomment that, and I called it subject multicast. And can I just get rid? Oh yeah, it's this one, right? Cool. I've got a bit more going on here. Actually, I don't think I needed some of these import statements. I don't think I needed that. I think that's it. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to create. Let's not worry about the alive for now, actually. But same thing before. I'm creating a variable I, set it to 0. I'm going to create my new observable. I'm going to log out when that subscription is created, increment I, set my my interval to go ahead and emit that value I. My teardown function is going to clear that interval. Again, let's just ignore this for right now. We'll kind of come back to subscription management towards the end. And then this is what's important down here. So what I'm going to do is on my observable, I'm going to use an operator called publish. And publish is going to return a connectable observable. Right, John?
That's correct.
John's been helping me a bit with this presentation. I got to shout out to him at the end, but I'm going to shout out to him now. We've kind of been learning off each other over the last couple of months and stuff, which has been a lot of fun. And so this variable multicasted is of type connectable observable. And I can subscribe to that just like an observable. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create 2 subscriptions. We're going to just the same. We're going to log out first subscription in the value. We're going to log out second subscription in the value. And then I'm going to, on that connectable observable, the able part of connectable, I'm going to go ahead and then use the connect method on that connectable observable class. And that is going to return a connection. And can I do anything with the connection afterwards?
I think there is something you can do. We were looking at some RX documentation that had methods that weren't actually involved in RxJS. So
oh, they're more ReactiveX rather than RxJS, right?
It was all .NET examples we were looking at when we first looked at that.
Yep.
So there are things you can do on it, but I'm not sure that any of them actually apply in this particular context.
Okay, so let's just get rid of that. You didn't see anything, okay? So then we're going to go ahead and we're going to invoke this connect method. And then finally, I'm going to set a timeout. So after 5 seconds, I'm going to basically complete my observable using another way of subscription management that I really personally favor called take while. It's another one of the many operators that we have available to us. But basically, after 5 seconds, I'm going to complete the observable, okay? So let's go ahead and save that. Hope it still works. And it does. Oh, this one's going every 1 second. Sorry about that. We were playing around with it. Whereas the other example is every 2 seconds. But nonetheless, you can see that our I value only gets incremented once, and you can see that I'm only creating a single subscription, right? And so this is this concept of multicasting. And I think I had a really fantastic sentence here at the bottom. I basically said, a multicasted observable emits the results to multiple observers using a single subscription to the underlying stream. So if I have an HTTP client that I'm using in Angular, right, that underlying stream is going to be the value that HTTP client emits when that HTTP response comes back. And then I can then, using a multicast, I can have multiple observers, whether those are async pipes, whether those are subscriptions in your control or your component or whatever you're doing that's subscribing. And then those will all get the same value. So one value comes in underneath, and then all of those get the same value that was emitted from your HTTP client. So very helpful if you're doing any sort of, you got lots of async pipes in a single template, or if you're doing multiple subscriptions to the same underlying stream.
There is another aspect to connectable observables.
Yeah, sure.
You might be able to demonstrate here. If you comment out line 39, you might be able to demonstrate why we have connect. That's why we have connect.
Because it just doesn't bind it.
It doesn't bind anything. It allows us to control timing. So in addition to making sure you don't replay your HTTP calls n number of times for however many subscriptions you have, you can also control when things actually start moving through the stream. And that happens when you call connect.
On that connect call. Cool. All right. Any questions there? Confusion? Yeah, go ahead, man.
So on the connect, is that like lazy evaluate it? So does it set it up and it doesn't fire it until you welcome it?
Yeah, it would be
when
a cold.
Publish, it'll basically grab the value, and then you can set up all your subscriptions and call connect. And that's
Anytime
when it'll, like,
afterwards.
start streaming out there. And you can still subscribe after you call connect, but they won't get that first value. You could probably
So does it connect those values before you call connect?
it publish should be grabbing the value at that point in time, and then connect
As soon as you
will
publish.
through. Yeah.
Yep. Does that answer your question, man? Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Cool. One of the other things that we wanted to kind of mention, and when John and I were kind of talking about this presentation, was this concept of hot or cold. And I think I watched the YouTube video. I didn't make the meetup, but I think about a year ago, or maybe less than a year ago, I think somebody did a talk on hot or cold observables. And so if you saw that, I hope I don't bore you the next couple of minutes. But we're going to quickly just talk on that. Since we're doing a whole intro to RxJS, there is this concept of an observable being hot or cold, right? And a cold observable is when the source of the events or values, which we might call like a provider or a producer, only happens when we subscribe to it. And we see that all the time in Angular, right? So HTTP client is cold, right? It's not until I subscribe to that observable that gets returned from HTTP client that does it actually invoke the HTTP request, right? So that's cold because the producer is basically within that observer, or within the observer function, I think is the proper way to say it, right? On the opposite side of that, a hot observable is when the producer is basically outside of that, right? And so the observable closes around an already existing producer. I just said this actually. So cold observables, you're already using them in Angular. It's not until you subscribe to that HTTP service. I also mentioned this as well when we talked about Unicast and multicasting. We talked about multiple subscriptions to an HTTP observer results and multiple HTTP calls to the same endpoint. So we kind of looked at that. So let's take a look at an example of a cold observable. And I got a nice little note here to myself that I need to start my socket server before I forget. Let's grab up this. Don't remember what I called it. Server. Did you write this for me? That's amazing. Yeah, I want to start the server. Oh, hold on. I was messing live coding. Not really.
It's not a meetup if you don't have some live coding.
There we go. I think I was messing around with something. I removed that on accident. Okay. All is good. So now we should have a socket server. I can show you that code. It's kind of not exactly important to this particular example with RxJS. But basically, I'm using socket.io. I'm creating a quick socket server. And every second, I'm going to go ahead and emit a message. And the payload here is going to have a property message with hello as a string. And then this ID, which I'm just going to increment every single time. So we should see that come through. And I'm going to run that on server 3000, or on port 3000, excuse me. All right, let me save that. Let's go over to observable cold. Cool. Double, see that double? That's like, Brian, really don't forget this, dude. Otherwise, you're going to mess this up. Because I did that. I ran through this like twice already, and I was like, oh, I keep forgetting to start the server. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So basically, this is going to be a cold observable. And the main reason why this is a cold observable is because I'm not going to actually create a connection to my socket server until I subscribe, right? And so the way that's happening is here inside here, right? So when you subscribe, it's going to call this observer function, and then it's going to create a new subscription. We're going to log that out. We're going to create a new connection to our socket server. And when the socket server emits a message, we're going to go ahead and we're just going to emit that next value to my observers.
Ideally, you can create a type that could be shared between this client code and server code for the message. Because
I could have an interface.
Now you're just abandoning.
I am.
Type safety.
I am. He's calling me out on TypeScript, folks. Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually a really good point, right? I could have like a shared like lib models or something, right? And in there, I could export an interface called like iMessage if you like the I prefix or not. And then I could have message and ID as properties to that. And that way I get type safety. Because otherwise, we don't know what data is. Yep. And in fact, you can see I got really lazy and I gave it the old any because
basically you're writing JavaScript and TypeScript.
That's right. You know, and it passed code review. It really did. My PR got merged. So, and the boss loved it. He was like, "It looks so good." That's all joking aside. All right. And then my teardown function, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect from my socket. And then you're going to see that I'm just going to subscribe. I'm going to receive that any message again. Thank you, Gregory. I think that's your name. And I'm going to log out this any object. I don't even have any idea what it is, but it's going to be fantastic. It's been running the whole time while we've been chatting. You can see that I created a single subscription, and then here's my values that are being coming out of my socket, and then I'm emitting those values into my stream. And you can see that that's cold because if I go ahead and, well, I guess I'd have to go and look at the actual socket connection. But you can see that I'm not going to create the connection. Just like an HTTP client, that request is never going to get fired off.
Can you duplicate it? Duplicate the subscription line?
Can I duplicate it? Sure. Like, you thinking like this?
Yeah.
Yep. And that's actually going to create two socket connections. Because I'm not multicasting. Though, I might want to correct myself. Socket.io may see that it's the same origin and just do one connection. I'm not a Socket.io expert, but that might be the case. I don't know if anybody else is like, yeah, that's right or wrong, but I think Socket.io will...
There are multiple connections.
There will be multiple connections? Thanks, man.
That's what happens.
So, yeah, he's run into it. He's like, yeah, there's definitely multiple connections, bro. Cool. And we can see those values coming out, you know, in pairs. Oh, that was a bad highlight, but yeah. Cool. There was something else here I wanted to show you. Oh, how about that? Multiple subscriptions will create multiple socket connections. You guys are reading my mind. I love it. So here I'm going to create two subscriptions again. I did first and second here for those values. And then I'm going to go ahead and after 6 seconds, I'm going to unsubscribe. I'm using that same technique where I'm keeping track of the subscription and calling add to add that child subscription. And then I'll call subscribe on that parent, which will unsubscribe from both of those. So if we save those.
You keep them,
Oh, now there's 3. Yeah. Let's go ahead and comment that out just so it's not totally confusing. Yeah. So I get 2, and then here they come in pairs. Yep. And then I kill it. Yeah, go ahead in the back, man.
The only purpose for you adding that to the parent just so you can unsubscribe?
Yeah, otherwise, I actually, to be fair, when I first started with subscriptions, and this was in Angular, right? So like in my component, I created like an array of subscriptions, and then I started like pushing them onto this array. And then in my onDestroy lifecycle method, I like for each or whatever, I went through them all and unsubscribed from each one, which is totally doable, but you don't have to because of add. So you can, on a subscription, you can add child subscriptions, and then when you unsubscribe, it'll unsubscribe from all child subscriptions as well as itself.
So you can always create a dummy one without any handler and then add children to it.
Like just create a new instance of a subscription?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Without any handler and just add stuff that does something.
Yep. So it's one of, I would say, probably 3 common approaches to dealing, actually 4. Yeah, I think what he's saying is like we could do something like, I think what I'm getting at is what you're saying is I could do, if I can type, I can just create a dummy subscription like what he's saying, and then I can just call .add on everything that I subscribe to. That's not what I want.
That's how you.
Like that.
That's how you connect to Observable.
Let's see if it works.
It shouldn't.
He's calling subscribe inside.
For each ad, you're calling subscribe on the observable.
Oh, yeah, this is return. Sorry, it's a bit nested here. Sorry. But this is returning a new subscription. Every time we call subscribe, it's going to return a new instance of the subscription or of the subscription class. So we get a new subscription every time. Yeah.
And so when you unsubscribe, it'll unsubscribe from everything.
Yeah.
Correct. Yep. And I'm going to actually, that's actually, I think, the next thing we're going to get into. And I would say that's probably one of 4 common approaches to dealing with subscription management. And I'm going to take a look at all of those. That being one of them. So I'm not going to show another demo of that. But that's basically one way to deal with subscription management is by calling add. And then at the end, you most likely an ng-on-destroy in your lifecycle method, call whatever subscription.unsubscribe. And then that'll take care of all of them for you. Cool. Let's take a look at a hot observable. Yeah, so one of the primary differences that you're going to notice between the cold and hot is I'm actually going to create my connection outside of the observable, right? So my producer has already been created, right? And then inside, all I'm going to do is listen to that message that is being emitted from the socket server and then invoke observer.next to send that value into the stream. And so that observable is already hot is because the socket is already listening. And then in my, I'm actually not going to create that connection every time. It's being created once outside of the observable. And I have another demo here. I don't remember what I was doing with this other demo.
Hopefully in your comments.
Let's see. Let's see. So here I'm creating that connection inside. I don't.
Oh, share.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So in this instance, I'm going to use the share operator, which is part of RxJS, that allows us to pretty easily do multicasting, right? So in this instance, I've got a cold observable. So my producer is inside. and we should see, hopefully anyways, I'm going to subscribe to it twice. Right here, I'm doing a subscribe.
They'll do just one.
I'm doing one subscribe, yep. And then I'm going to unsubscribe again after 6 seconds. But because I'm using the share operator, that's going to provide multicasting for us. And we should see a single subscription be created and logged out. So if I save that, we can see only one subscription is created because I'm using the share operator to do multicasting. I'm going to get all those same values. So I've only created one connection to my socket server. And I'm getting all those values, and I'm going to unsubscribe after 6 seconds. So share is a really easy way to do multicasting.
I don't really understand the share when you're invoking it. You're not invoking it on anything. I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah. So how many people are familiar with like RxJS 5.5, or are most people on 5.4? Most people are on 5.4. Do you have any idea what I'm talking about? No. Okay. RxJS 5.5 dropped about, I don't know, 2 months ago, I guess, or something like that. And they came out with this thing called Lettable Operators. And then they realized that was actually a really bad name. And so then they changed the name to Pipeable Operators. I think it's kind of funny, actually. So if you do Lettable Operators, RxJS, and we go to the page, they say, stop trying to make lettable happen. We're calling them Pipeable Operators because no one knows what the heck lettable means. So they used to be called lettable operators, but now we call them Pipeable Operators, which kind of makes sense because they're inside of a pipe. And so before RxJS 5.5, if you're using RxJS 5.4, which would be Angular 4 and lower, so I guess 2 and 4, basically you would just invoke operators onto an observable. So you would probably do something up top like import RxJS, add operator share, and then that would basically add the share operator, and then you would just do .share on the observable. And I don't fully understand all the details, so excuse me if I get this wrong, but the way I understand it is they've moved to this new Pipeable Operators to allow better tree shaking, so that way your bundle sizes are smaller. And so what we do now is an observable, the class observable, has a method on it called pipe now. And in the pipe, we can give it basically one or many operators. So I could do share, and I know we're not going into operators here, but I could do like tap, and then you just comma separated them. You can do like switch map or whatever it's going to be, and you can just kind of stack these all up like you would before by using like a dot notation, like .share, I guess it was do before .do, .switch map, and all these other operators. Now in RxJS 5.5 we have the pipe, and so this is now kind of the newer syntax.
It's not a syntax, it's just a pipe as a function.
Pipe is just a method on the observable.
Yeah, and it accepts the list of arguments, and each call just to put the argument on the list. And each one probably returns a function that will get pipe.
Yeah, and they just go in order. Yep. Does that answer your question or no? Oh, it does. Cool. And again, my understanding is this provides for better tree shaking and for lower bundle sizes, which makes our users happy. All right. We're getting there. I'm sorry I'm running a little long, but I swear we're almost to the end. Where's my presentation? There it is. Yeah, I mean, I basically said all of this here, so I'm not going to read the slide. But you know, we have this concept of hot observables. We use share to make a cold observable hot, and if you're using NGRX, those observables are hot. So multiple subscriptions to the action observable process the same events from the same single source. I got ahead of myself there. Okay, cool. So lastly, I just want to talk about subscription management. And we've kind of talked about it a little bit while we've been doing like subscription.add and some of the questions that we've had. But basically, why do we unsubscribe? The number one reason, memory leak, right? So if we don't unsubscribe, that observable, that subscription is just going to hang out there. I'm like an old school developer. I've been doing this for a long time. I don't know about you guys, but like back in the day, like event listeners, and then you had to like remove your event listener. Yeah, I don't know. I guess in Angular we don't have to do that anymore. Thank God. But with observables, we want to make sure that we unsubscribe. So that way we prevent memory leaks. Two things that I actually recently learned, thanks to a video by Rob Wormold on the Angular core team. So you don't need to unsubscribe from HTTP client or activated route. So activated route has a bunch of observables like param map. I can't think of all of them right now. You don't need to worry about unsubscribing from those, nor do you need to worry about unsubscribing from HTTP client. Because behind the scenes, Angular knows that those are going to basically emit once, and it's going to complete the stream for you. So don't worry about it. So if you got an HTTP client and you're subscribing to it, you're good. Don't worry about it, right? So how do we deal with subscription management? The first thing is really important. Async pipe, use it. Why? Because it does it for you. Async pipe will subscribe, it'll unsubscribe, you're good to go. You don't have to do anything. It's very easy. So when you can and when it makes sense in the architecture of your application, use the async pipe. It's there for you. You can also invoke unsubscribe on a subscription like we've seen several times now in the presentation. And then finally, we can also use two operators that are provided by RxJS, take while and take until. And I've kind of gotten into the habit of using these because it's really nice because in my pipe, I can put those right next to my subscription. So if I'm doing like that pipe and I'm doing like a map or a filter and a switch map and then subscribing, it's all right there. And so I don't have to like remember to do this like keeping track of the subscription in a public variable or private, I guess, and then implementing on destroy and having an ng on destroy function that's going to go ahead and take care of that. So let me just dive into take while and take until. Here we go. Thank you. Because I would have been like, what's going on? All right, cool. So take while. I'm going to basically just create an observable of an interval every second. I'm going to emit a value. I don't need that. That was from when I was doing some other stuff. I'm going to emit that integer value, so it'll be, I think, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and go up. I'm going to go ahead and store my component state. I wanted to make this presentation like agnostic to Angular or whatever, so if you're not using Angular, likely you would have in your component, you'd have like a private property called isAlive or alive or whatever Boolean, whatever name you want to give your Boolean value. And then in my observable, we use pipe, and we're going to use take while, which accepts a function that returns a Boolean value. And I'm just going to say, hey, keep taking these values until alive is false, right? And I'm going to subscribe and just log out that value. And then after 6 seconds, I'm going to go ahead and toggle alive to false. You know, similar when we were talking about like calling unsubscribe in Angular, this is where you would use your ng on destroy lifecycle method, and then you would just set like this.alive equals false, right? And what that's going to do for us is that is going to complete all of your observables that are using take while inside your component. So if I reload this, I think we went for 6 seconds. So we should see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're done. It's completed. So that's one really simple, easy way to deal with subscription management. Again, use the async pipe when it makes sense. And then the last one that we're going to talk about tonight is take until, which is very similar to take while. Take until, the only difference is it uses an observable rather than just a Boolean value. And so, again, I'm going to create an interval. I don't think I need that. I'm going to create an interval that's going to emit every second. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pipe. I'm going to create an unsubscribe off of that observable, and I'm going to pipe to that, and I'm going to filter whenever that value is greater than 2 and whenever it's an even number. And then in my observable, I'm going to pipe to take until. I'm going to provide it that observable. So basically, until that observable unsubscribe, so when that unsubscribe emits a value, it'll complete the observable. And so what we should see is we should see this value get logged out as long as this is true, right? True. Yeah. So let's take a look at that. So we see we get 0, 1, 2, 3. It gets to 4. It's now an even value. That observable emits a value, and our subscription is complete. It's kind of a. I find myself honestly using take while more often because I just want to like unsubscribe as soon as the component's dead or destroyed, right? But this might be helpful if you've got like a secondary reason why you want to unsubscribe when such and such behavior is met or whatever. So something like that.
If you have observable streams that are outside of the component.
Or you have observable streams that are outside the component. Yeah.
That might happen.
Yep. Yep. Very cool. Any other questions on the subscription stuff? Yeah, man, in the back.
Yeah, I'm wondering under what circumstances or when does it run the teardown, particularly for the hot.
So the teardown is invoked when you call when it receives a completion notification. So remember in the beginning we talked about the notification class, and it gets a next, an error, or a completion. So when that completion is emitted, that's when the teardown function will be invoked.
So for a cold one, is it going to do that for every subscription? Or just...
Yeah. So
It's going to run the observer function every time, so it's going to get a new teardown. It's going to run every teardown.
Correct.
Yeah, with cold, you get the whole thing every time. You create a new one, it gives you a value, and it completes for each and every single subscription you have.
Yep.
And then the sorry, give me a second. Go ahead.
Anybody else got a question while he's formulating his ideas or his question? Oh, he got it. The light bulb went on. I saw it. It illuminated.
For the example 1 and 2 for the hot, is there any reason why you'd want to use the 1 rather than 2, other than 2 is just a new feature?
Like using, you mean like using the share operator?
Yeah, it seems like that version was better, because it's only going to call the observable one. It's only going to create 1 subscription to the socket.io. It's only going to tear down 1.
You know, it really depends on the architecture application and what's going on. You know, I don't know if I would say one is better than the other.
Well, one of the biggest differences between multicast and unicast is that unicast is a direct connection to that subject or whatnot, whereas multicast, this is what I have, take it or leave it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there is really no callback that you can essentially do.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it depends on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you may already have something that's providing the events. You may not be able to create it inside of your organization, which is why you need to close around it. I mean, some things that may already exist, maybe browser things, the browser events. And they already be feeding values to you. You may close around it to make up.
Yeah, I think it's just your mileage may vary.
Yeah.
It really just depends on the architecture of the application and what you're doing. Yeah, go ahead, man.
Can you do bidirectional communication with the observable? So like send a data or send the value back to the observable from subscriber?
Not that I'm aware of. Anybody disagree with that? The question was, can you do bidirectional communication with observables? I think it's just a single stream of data from an observable to an observer, or one or more multiple observers, right? Yeah, it's definitely a one-way communication thing.
I suppose you could extend subject.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a good idea. I mean, I don't know. They kind of learned that with AngularJS and bidirectional communication. But we won't go there. We all love Angular. Anything else? Very cool. You know, I mentioned this already. John, my buddy standing over there with the t-shirt on, he was definitely a help in this. Ben Lesh, a huge thanks to him for everything that he's done with RxJS, which is incredible. And of course, a huge thanks to the Angular community, learning a lot of this. And just a quick teaser, here's what might be coming, no promises, but we might dive into like 20 operators next month. I promise not to go as long, or I'll try not to. And so if you've used some of these, hopefully they look familiar. If you haven't, maybe like fork join or some of these other, you might be like, hey, I'm really interested in this. So come back next month. And then maybe the following month we might dive into testing with RX Marbles and talk about testing of NGRX effects and observables and awesome, more stuff like that. So cool, thanks for your time, guys.
All right, before you guys take off,